So when it comes to children, back home, when our transport team do outreach education for either EMS agencies or hospitals that have kids, and if they're honest, they desperately really don't want to take care of horribly sick kids. Because at the end of the day, most of us are far more familiar and far more comfortable taking care of big people. So with that in mind, back home, when we do outreach education in regards to taking care of sick kids, simply what I teach is two simple things. And I'm like, honestly, if you have a sick kid and you remember nothing else but these two things, until we go ahead and take your kid away, the transport team is going to be thrilled. The first of which is something called pink, warm, and sweet. Pink, warm, and sweet, a neonatologist or a baby ICU doctor years ago when I first started doing transport simply said, all you got to remember if you're picking up a sick kid is just keep them pink, warm, and sweet. He's like, honestly, everything else is fluff. So what that came down to was pink means keep them pink, otherwise known as give them oxygen. They're not COPDers, go nutty, give them as much as you want. And unless they're a really funky heart kid, meaning they've got flipped upside down and backwards heart disease, which is incredibly rare, the vast majority of issues when it comes to kids are respiratory. So he's like, simply give them oxygen until they turn pink. Warm means keep them warm. And that's important because whether it's a medical or a traumatic emergency, especially when they hit the ER, we tend to get people naked. We cut off their clothes and they lay naked on a stretcher, naked on a spine board. So with that, he's like, simply keep them warm, meaning cover up their bodies, take a look, see what you need to see, and then more importantly, cover it back up. And he's like, cover up their bodies, but especially in little kids, cover up their big old heads. Because under the age of 2, little kids, you remember, have a medical phenomenon called big head, little body. They've got big old Charlie Brown heads on top of their little tiny bodies. So he's like, cover up their bodies, but especially cover up their big old heads. Sweet really means two things, the first of which is check a sugar. Because when little kids are stressed, they drop their sugars. Meaning for medics, if a kid is anything but cute, when you've got a free second, check a sugar. In the ER, if they're anything but cute, before they leave, and even better, when they hit the door, somewhere in between, make sure you take a quick second and check a sugar. Because when kids are stressed, they drop the sugars. Sweet also means make them act sweet. Meaning they crack both femurs, give them something for pain. And if they're intubated, they don't want to be intubated, you want to keep them intubated. Well, just like adults, there's lots of drugs to make you not mind the fact that you're intubated. And at the end of the day, pink, warm, and sweet. Now the other thing that came into play, which I blatantly stole from Dr. Pedi-Ed-Trics, a PZR doc from South Florida, whereas he came up with, a couple years ago, the idea of the ABCDEs, a pediatric arrest. And in my experience going around the country, this idea really is easy to remember. And more importantly, when you look at the research, especially with really sick kids, it really works. And the ABCs that all of us learned on our first day of healthcare, simply, when it comes to sick kids, A, meaning you arrive. You show up and you find the kid sick as a dog. B, everything bad that happens is respiratory. And if it's not respiratory, it's probably respiratory. So simply, since everything bad that happens is respiratory, either A, start bagging, or B, throw in some sort of a supraglottic, meaning a King airway, an I-gel, or an LMA. Because when it comes to backup airways, now all three devices, they make them now from babies all the way to big people. So A is you arrive, B, you start bagging, C, if they're in arrest, you start cranking on their chest, D, unless they have an IV in already, don't bother. Meaning grab their leg, grab their humerus, grab whatever the age of the child is, a site appropriate for their age, and go ahead and drill them, meaning use either the EZ-IO, bone injection gun, traditional Jamshidi, some sort of an intraosseous device. E means epi. Meaning, most kids had good hearts to begin with. They just had something really awful happen to them. And the research has shown, and it makes sense if you think about it, that if you get that first hit of epi on board sooner rather than later, it really makes a difference in actually bringing kids back. So for years, we've taught the ABCs, and then again, Dr. Entevi goes with the ABCDEs of arrest. But back home, one of the respiratory therapists that we work with took it one step further. And he's like, you've got your ABCs. He's like, but he also wants you to remember when it comes to kids, DEFG. Otherwise known as don't ever forget glucose. And that works with the same idea as it plays with pink, warm, and sweet, where you give them oxygen, keep them warm, and check a sugar. And when it comes to horribly sick kids, A, B, C, D, E, or if you want to take it one step further, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, meaning check a sugar, is really where it's at when it comes to sick kids. So the question is, it sounded like a relatively simple concepts, and do people tend to overcomplicate pediatric care? Absolutely. My personal feelings is because, number one, it's a kid, and understandably the emotion level is through the roof because it's a kid. And number two, not only is it a kid, but happily most of us don't take care of horribly sick kids every day. So with that in mind, people tend to focus on a lot of the minutiae. However, a ER doc taught me years ago, which I just thought is brilliant. He's the whole idea of children are not small adults. That seemingly is taught in pediatrics from day one. He's a peds ER doc. He's like, get over it. He's like, last time I looked, they had one trachea and two lungs. Last time I looked, they were in the same spot. So he's like, you know what? If you're gonna intubate them, it's the same stuff, just a smaller tube. If you're gonna give them drugs, with very few exceptions, it's exactly the same stuff as you give to a big person, just a smaller dose. So when it comes to kids, you know what you want to do with big people because you do that every day. And happily, with very few exceptions, you do exactly the same thing when it comes to kids, just a smaller version. I think the biggest things that I've personally come across with is when it comes to kids is people instinctively want to memorize numbers. And over the years now, after almost 30 years of happily playing transport nurse, I am completely at the other end of the spectrum, whereas I think when it comes to kids, the absolute worst thing you can do is try to do mental math. And there's various cheat sheets out there, whether they are for your pocket, your iPhone, your Crackberry, whatever it might be, there are boatloads of cheat sheets out there. There's various other electronic systems. And honestly, I think when it comes to kids, that this is really unquestionably going to be the future. Because if you've got a sick kid, you know what you want to do. The problem is trying to do mental math at 3 o'clock in the morning when a kid is trying to die in the back of your rig. Decimal points really do make a difference. And if you have either a cheat sheet or some sort of an app that you can simply click on the color, you can click on the age, and on the screen it pops up saying this size tube and this much epi. I think it's honestly going to change the world of pediatrics because it's not that you can't do math. It's just when the kid is sick, why do math if you don't need to?